Hi everyone, and thank you for joining today. I'm Joe McGregor. I'm co-lead of the Glaciers and Sea Level collaboration team with Caitlin Florentine, who's also on the line. And this is, I think, the Glaciers team first three-team meeting in terms of the groups in IRPIC that are included. Along with, I guess, 4 team if you including the self-forming team. So yeah, maybe we've set an IRPIC record. I don't know. So we've also got members of the Terrestrial Ecosystems collaboration team here and the Permafrost collaboration team. And I think I think Christina, I saw Ben, Jeremy. Who else have I missed who's co-lead? Oh, we got someone. Oh, I think we got some crosstalk there, but anyway, we've got a variety of folk here, and so hopefully you're seeing some unfamiliar names, and we'll be hearing about a topic that's at the intersection of our teams and interest more broadly, and that's what's going on in the Malaspina Glacier environment. And I'm a glaciologist, so I think more. I think about the glacier first and foremost, but it's changing so rapidly that the paraglacial environment is also quite unusual. And there is also a new NSF-sponsored project to study the glacier and its environs in more detail. And so when we were coming up with ideas for this meeting, we thought we would try to reach out to folks who have been there or going there, thinking hard about it. And so with that in mind, we've got 3 speakers today, actually. We've got Bretwood Higman, or Hig, from Ground Truth Trekking, a Alaska-based nonprofit, who'll be speaking about his and his family's experiences crossing the Malaspina Glacier environment. And then we've got Doug Brinkerhoff, a glaciologist at University of Montana. And we've got Kristen Tim. Kristen, I forget where you're based. Apologies for that. But a social scientist who's part of the Malaspina Glacier Project, helping us to understand the environment a little bit better. So, with that, I think in the with the agenda, we've got Hig up first, and with that, I will turn it over to Hig unless any of the other co-leads want to share anything else.
That sounds good. Thanks for the introduction, Joe. And to clarify real quick, Kristen is at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I think that's where you currently are, and a recent PhD graduate.
Oh, okay. My apologies. Okay, great. So with that, we'll start with Hig. Hig, do you want to share your screen? Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm a huge fan of Malaspina Glacier. I'm not a glaciologist, maybe somewhat of a glacier enthusiast, but my actual background is geologic hazards, some stratigraphy and geomorphology. Definitely speaking more as a adventurer and maybe someone with kind of boyish enthusiasm for this strange little piece of our planet. So I'm going to start my timer because I really have no idea how long this will go. So I'll just kind of make sure it stays within 15-ish minutes. Yeah, so Malaspina Glacier is not really a place most people just stumble on their way to somewhere else. However, that is kind of how I first became acquainted with it after finishing up grad school with Joe down here at the UW Seattle. My wife and I spent about a year walking out to the Aleutians, and we passed Malaspinas right here, kind of right at the boundary between Southeast and South Central Alaska. We went through this area in the winter. It was actually, we got our first snow on us when we were in Yakutat and headed west from there. Oops, there we go. So Malaspina Glacier, it's very large. This is a slide from a non-scientific talk, so apology for the English units. But if you can probably imagine wherever you are right now, if you plopped it down, it's probably going to fit whatever city or whatever you're in. It'll probably fit nicely inside of here. And it's easy if you just kind of outline it to kind of imagine it as this huge, homogeneous white expanse. But kind of one of the things I'm hoping you'll get out of my talk is just some idea of the diversity. You can take and start coloring in this glacier. This is some of the rubble and moraine and such covering the surface. It's actually vegetated over a very large extent. These are many, many square miles of vegetated ice. It's getting less and less as these areas break up as it melts, but there's still huge forests and stuff on top of the ice. And really you could take and walk, a quarter mile anywhere in this entire area and cross just really dramatic changes in the nature of the place. And so this is that walk I mentioned. So each of the dots here are campsites. So we really kind of whisked past here. We really only camped once properly on the edge of Malaspina Glacier. Spent a couple days kind of passing by it there. This is right in the middle of winter, or, in the late fall. Technically, this is like the end of November, but it's getting into the darkest time, stormiest time in Alaska. Really intense time to be on this landscape, and you really get to see it at its most active. So this, for example, is the clay bluffs, the moraine bluffs that are just west of Malaspina. And if you were to go back 150 years, this is not west of Malaspina. It's actually on a suture between the Icy Bay lobe and the Agassiz lobe of Malaspina Glacier. However, the Icy Bay lobe has since vanished, so it's now kind of off the edge of the glacier. It's not all like horrible weather. We actually had some fantastic weather passing through here. Got to see the sea lion haul out. That's kind of a seasonal sea lion haul out on the moraine. There was kind of one spot in here that particularly enchanted me. We referred to it as Sakegi Lagoon, and it's, if you look at the old USGS maps, the name Sakegi is associated with a set of bluffs along here. There were high like forested bluffs down to the ocean. However, those don't exist anymore. Those bluffs were all on top of ice, and there's now this lagoon opening up. Not the greatest aesthetics in these photos, and it may not look that enchanting, but I was really fascinated by this location. And this is a photo from a few years later, but you get some sense of what the geometry is. So although you might think the glacier is way back here, actually all of this is underlain by ice. The glacier is pressed right up behind the beach, and the beach is formed on the moraine. And there's a little slough channel here that connects the ocean to this lagoon. Often people will say the largest tidewater glacier in North America is the Hubbard Glacier, a little bit east of here. But Malaspina is very definitely tidewater and is much bigger than Hubbard. And actually, Bering Glacier is a little bit tidewater too. So anyway, we had this brief experience with the glacier, and kind of felt like we needed to come back. And so 4 years later, we did a trip. We titled the trip "Life on Ice." In the meantime, in those 4 years, my wife and I had a couple of children who were still in diapers when we arrived here. For reasons that I don't totally recall, we came in the fall again, right when the weather is at its worst. And we spent about 2 months between mid-September and mid-November on or right next to Malaspina Glacier. So here's that trip I mentioned before. What we did this time was much slower, and the numbers in here are the number of days we spent at various different base camps along the way. And so we started out up here in the Samovar Hills. We crossed the ice, went along the coast, and went and spent some time around Malaspina Lake as well. Which is actually a lagoon also right here. This is kind of the view from the Samovar Hills with my daughter Latuya as the center of attention, as she often is, but with St. Elias in the background and Malaspina spilling around the Samovar Hills, which are really a pretty interesting place to be in general. They're actually this island in the middle of moving glacier, but with a quite elaborate ecosystem. We saw brown bears, which you can kind of imagine those guys crossing the ice, being commuters, but there were also wolverine and marmots, and also in the streams there are dolly varden. Kind of an interesting ecosystem. It's also an area with fossil fuels right at the surface. So there are oil springs. This is one of the oil springs there, and also natural gas springs coming up out of the ground And so you can go down to the bottom edge of that and look back into the Samovar Hills and be standing in a paraglacial environment, but see places that have quite established ecosystems. So we went from there, we walked across the ice. It's a huge, huge landscape of these kind of rolling hills of ice. Long after being here and taking this photo, I came to appreciate that these swales that you see are actually strongly related to the basal geometry of the glacier. And I think we'll hear maybe some about that in Doug's talk, I'm guessing. And here's some of these are actually rocks here. It's a huge collection of marble boulders that are kind of clustered in this one spot. We did come across at least one glacier mouse, which I just thought was kind of cool. So I threw that photo in there. So again, we're here in the fall, not necessarily the easiest time. But we did manage to make our way back to Sitkagi Lagoon, which had grown a lot. It was about twice as big as when we were there previously. So this is now 2011. We were there originally in 2007. And we spent some time there this time and explored. At this time, there was a separate lake behind the lagoon. This has now become part of the lagoon. Some of our efforts to move between these places, at one point we spent an entire day going about a quarter mile through crevassed forest, basically with alder forest that's like falling into crevasses and with mud and boulders on it. And since then, there was actually a third time I've been there, and we paddled that distance in about 10 minutes. So it's getting easier, I suppose, in that way. So this is an image of that outlet to the lagoon. So Sitkagi Lagoon is back here, the ocean's out there, and this is the kind of deflated moraine with the slough crossing it. And these boulders, of course, provide some really excellent armoring for this. And so one of the really obvious questions when you're here, and one of the things that I've puzzled over a lot, and I know there are people actively working now on trying to understand this, is what would it take? Is it likely that this will eventually open up and become more of an open passage between the ocean and the lagoon? And one of the things we got to see while we were here is there was a storm in the fall of 2011 that was probably on the order of a 1-year storm. It was a pretty big event. It's not, a 100-year storm by any means, but it was a pretty big event. We could, just judging by what sort of erosion and stuff went on, we think it was a pretty significant one. We went, so looking at this area, we went and explored the same area after this huge storm rolled in. And one of the interesting things is you would see boulders up to almost 2 meters in diameter that were clearly transported during the storm. So this one you can see has a different algae on it than the surrounding boulders, which are much more worn in this photo and then in the previous one because of the storm. But so this boulder was transported from somewhere down in the lower intertidal. And here's a boulder where you can see a big chunk of it chipped off by some collision in the waves. And that, I mean, judging by my foot, that's something like a meter by 50 centimeters, fairly significant chunk of rock getting thrown around. So these are definitely it's still an active sedimentary environment. And there's a lot of things you might wonder about what is to come and what would it take to kind of jar things out of place. I'm just going to show you a little bit of data, actually. So just to get you oriented here, this is the southern edge of Malaspina Glacier, and we've been talking about this lagoon here. And now this photo is taken well after those earlier shots, but in a couple of the trips I've taken here, we've gone out with just a stick and a rock and some string and measured the depth. So some high-tech scientific observation. And one of the things that's really striking is as you go inside of this, the depths drop off very quickly. These are depths in meters, the numbers on these. So you see it gets to 30 meters, let's see here, 170 meters in from the edge from the moraine. And it's typically 50 to 70 meters deep out in the main part of the lagoon. And you can also see how this, this expanding lagoon is now getting close to connecting to this lake, which has points that are 75 meters deep, and maybe even this additional lake here. And so we get this, this steep gradient on this side. So anything that gets pushed into the lake quickly moves out of the depth range where it can really protect the lagoon from further erosion. Let's see here. This is also a chance with spending that much time to really see some of the other weird elements of Malaspina Glacier. We actually spent some time exploring a river that changed direction and tunneled in under the glacier in one place. One of the things I found most fascinating was the supercooled ice springs, which are fairly widespread along the margin of the glacier, and probably suggests some pretty steep gradients, just like our bathymetry data was showing, some pretty steep gradients down to water that's under quite a bit of pressure and in contact with ice. And so this was one of the things we spent a lot of time exploring, kind of out along this edge here. In 2015, there was a giant tsunami up in Icy Bay, which is more my area of expertise. And so I went there and worked on it with a big scientific team on that. And we were taking a boat back towards Yakutat, and one of my field assistants, my friend Andrew Maddox, and I jumped ship pretty literally off the coast in pack rafts and paddled into shore, and then spent a little more time exploring in Malaspina. So another opportunity to see some of the weird marginal environments along the edge of Malaspina. This is not easy traveling. It's a constantly changing and very, very complex landscape, but pack rafts really help kind of open up some possibilities as far as moving around in here. So here's one of these super cooled springs, one of the most dramatic ones that had moved position since we were there. And so this is now 2016. It had moved a ways to another location, was popping out in the middle of this brush patch since we were there in 2011. We also did get out on the glacier proper a bit here with a little thin blanket of fog over it and St. Elias in the background. Got to explore around in the ice. One of the things that's we really enjoyed both in 2011 and 2016 was following these ice highways through the between the moraine ridges out on the glacier. And I think that one of the reasons that one of the things that kept pulling me back here is the chance to just see landscapes emerging that are typical, that you see typically all over Alaska and anywhere that was heavily glaciated, where you know, now Malaspina is fairly unique as a Piedmont glacier, but late in the last ice age, they were quite widespread. And so you see the formation of landforms that normally you only get to see the long after remnants of. So these are kettle lakes actively forming in one area. So I don't want to ramble on too long, and I've kind of it looks like I'm coming up on 15 minutes, and I don't want to cut into other people's time either. So I think I will go ahead and end there. I don't know if we're going to do questions between presentations or at the end, but I would be happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Hig. We'll actually take questions at the end, so we can sort of combine and see and see where linkages might be. So we'll move on next to hear from Kristen and Doug. I've known you for a long time, Hig, but I will say a question I think that's on everyone's mind. You did what? You know, I've kept, so yeah, very, very interesting to see. Thank you so much. Okay, great. Kristen, do you want, or sorry, it was actually Doug was sharing the slides earlier. All right, Doug, take it away. Oh, you've got a chat window open. Okay, or yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for inviting us to present on this work today. I'm just going to start by briefly introducing the whole team that's working on the project. So myself and Doug are here presenting, but the rest of our team is listed here, and Martin Truffer is the PI on this project to study the Malaspina Glacier. And you want to go to the next slide, Doug? And just a little bit of context for anybody who's not familiar with this region. I think Hig introduced this pretty well, but the Malaspina Glacier is the world's largest Piedmont glacier. It's located just about 30 miles northwest of Yakutat, within the Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve and on the traditional lands of the Tlingit people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug to talk a little bit about the sort of natural science part of the project, and then I will wrap up at the end by talking a little bit about the social science and communication aspects.
Cool, thank you, Kristen, and also thank you, Hig, for that super interesting presentation about some of the more, I feel like we'll all have a much better sort of intuitive sense for the scientific stuff that I'll present here on account of that. So Malaspina is a really interesting glacier glaciologically, partly because of how big and prominent a landscape feature it is, and partly because of the nature of the changes that are occurring there. So it's tempting to think of Malaspina as a land terminating glacier, and it's undergoing the type of changes that are typical of terrestrially terminating glaciers. So if we see here on the left, near the sort of terminus, there's large sort of thinning distributed across the whole terminus region. But it's also, like Higgs said, only separated from the ocean by this small spit of lake-studded moraine. And in those lakes, it's undergoing something that looks a lot more like the calving retreats that we typically identify with tidewater glaciers. You can see here on the right, the evolution of the very same lakes that Hig was discussing in his talk. And if this sort of tidewater type retreat becomes widespread, that will make Malaspina Glacier very vulnerable to catastrophic retreat. And this becomes a particularly interesting thought experiment when we look at Icy Bay and Yakutat Bay to the north and south, or rather to the east and west, I guess. And consider they were once very likely, well, we know actually for a fact that they were filled with glaciers not dissimilar to how Malaspina looks today. And so in 100 years, we can ask the question, will we be driving cruise ships into Malaspina Bay? And if so, that will certainly be the largest loss of ice from a single glacier outside of the ice caps. It'll obviously be a drastic change in the coastal landscape. And it'll also have strong implications for both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And so this project is aimed at understanding whether and how that will happen. And so our primary tool to address this question is a glacier evolution model that basically uses physics to couple snowfall and melt and ice flow and oceanic calving and sediment transport into this sort of set of self-consistent physics that allows us to predict how this thing will evolve under a variety of forcings. And here's an example of this, just a very silly, simple case of this model incorporating snowfall and growing this glacier. It's also sort of tied up in this inverse problem of trying to figure out where the bed is. But maybe the critical thing to think about is that it's super wrong. And the model is super wrong. This white stuff is the present day outline, and the heat map is the thickness. It's wrong because there's a ton of things that we don't know about how this system works. And our field and remote sensing program is aimed at figuring those things out. And so what are we trying to determine? So, oh, there we go. The first critical piece of evidence in trying to figure out what a glacier is going to do is the location of the bed. And so as part of Operation Icebridge and continuing efforts as part of this grant, over the last decade, various people, mostly in the upper right-hand corner here, have produced a pretty good bed model. This is from Brandon Tober. And we've learned a ton about sort of the shape of Malaspina's bed, where channels are, but I'm super excited to say that this effort's ramped up even more in the last year, particularly the spring, and these folks produced a much denser and broader flight pattern with a better radar. And critically, what that's allowed us to do is to see the bed in places away from the lobe, up here in the Seward Glacier and in the Agassiz trunks. That's really going to help us get a strong understanding of the way that mass that is deposited up high gets delivered down to the lobe. Additionally, we need to constrain how the ice flows here. And Mark Fonstock and others have created a really exceptional record of surface speeds from Landsat image cross correlation. And in doing so, we discovered actually that Malaspina began surging almost exactly to the day when we submitted this proposal, which is quite inconvenient, but it's also, it turns out, this is kind of standard operating procedure for Malaspina and perhaps Piedmont glaciers at large. We can look at this video on the right, which shows the Landsat record from 1972 until present. And we see that Malaspina does not flow in any sense like a steady glacier does. In fact, it's more like a delta where different portions of the lobe activate and deactivate over time and at different times in ways that are very difficult to predict. And this makes it very difficult to model this system, but it's a challenge that we're really enthusiastic about looking into. Additionally, we have plans to perform classic measurements of surface mass balance of all these red dots located across the lobe, as well as active seismics along this blue line in an attempt to understand whether Malaspina sits on bedrock or sediment, and whether that sort of character of that subglacial surface is likely to change, which has strong implications for the way that the glacier flows. And then finally, we are planning to use geophysics, in particular time domain electromagnetics, to measure the composition of this thermokarstic terminal moraine that Hig illustrated really effectively, to understand how it might evolve in response to warmer air and more frequent oceanic intrusions. And indeed, we believe that sort of the composition of this moraine is intimately connected with Malaspina's prospective stability. So putting our sort of scientific objectives back together, this field campaign is aimed at constraining Malaspina's flow, its surface mass balance, basal and terminal conditions. And with data on all of these processes in hand, we're hoping to be able to use this numerical model to credibly forecast the various ways in which Malaspina might change in the coming decades. So with that, I will hand it back to Kristen to talk about how we might communicate these results to the broader public.
Yeah, so thanks, Doug. And if you don't mind just pressing, this animation is going to play in the background, but shouldn't have any sound. So one of the goals of this project is to use the data generated to create realistic visualizations of what future projections of change might look like at the Malaspina Glacier, kind of similar to this animation from NASA that we're looking at now. And so we'll be working with a Fairbanks-based graphic artist, Russ Mitchell, to create these visualizations. And these visualizations can be used to communicate about the project in a variety of settings. We've been working with the National Park Service, so this may be integrated into future displays in the Visitor Center at Wrangell St. Elias National Park, or maybe worked into online outreach on social media or websites for the Park Service. And so the projections of change at the Malaspina Glacier provide a pretty unique opportunity to talk about glaciers and climate change more generally. Next slide. And as I'm sure many of us are aware, glaciers and images of glaciers are frequently used to talk about climate change. We see these images in a whole variety of different communication efforts through mass media, films, scientific communication, and artwork. However, relatively little is known about how these kinds of images actually influence the ways that people think, feel, or behave with respect to the issue of climate change. And so one of the first steps in this project for me is actually reviewing the work that's been done to date around glaciers and probably cryosphere more generally, and how that relates to climate change communication. So next slide. So I'm in the process of organizing some of the prior research that's been done on this topic. And so I'm organizing this in kind of 3 broad categories. So the first category is messengers. So basically, you know, who is using glaciers to communicate about climate change? You know, where are these kinds of images showing up? And so there's been a fair amount of work to date that's looked at glacier related imagery, like in mass media, and newspapers, but not a lot of work kind of looking at other places where glaciers are used to talk about climate change. And then the second kind of dimension here is around messages. So how are glaciers used to talk about climate change? You know, what kind of information is being conveyed? And I think one of the things that is kind of coming through in the literature, but is also, you know, just apparent in glaciers and how they're used in communication. There's this really strong temporal element and story that glaciers help communicate about the past, present, and future. And then in terms of effects, so what do people feel, know, or do because of glaciers and climate change and what they've learned? So what messages are they exposed to? How do they act on that information? Are the effects lasting, or are they just short term? And so next slide. And so 2 findings that have kind of stood out so far with respect to glaciers and climate change communication. The first kind of relates to this idea of glaciers used in climate change communication, but actually being a way that kind of reinforces that climate is something that's affecting, you know, the polar regions of the world, and not necessarily that climate change is affecting myself and my community somewhere else in more temperate regions. And then the other thing that's been showing up in some of the literature is this discussion about glaciers as being kind of a dramatic and creating this kind of permanent sense of loss. And because of these messages, using glaciers to talk about climate change might actually create kind of a sense of hopelessness, or that it's too late to do anything. And so towards the latter part of this project, as we develop these visualizations, these artistic visualizations, I'll be conducting an online survey experiment with a representative sample of US residents to look at whether we can pair these visualizations with written information that helps us better understand the ways that visualizing future change in glaciers affects the way that people think and feel about glaciers and climate change. And so we can use these results to kind of inform the design of the communication materials related to the future Malaspina Glacier visualizations. And next slide. And so why add a social science element to your broader impacts? I just added this here because this whole project kind of started off by, I had a conversation with Martin about, you know, creating these visualizations of the Malaspina Glacier in the future, and, you know, realizing, hey, there's a lot we could actually learn about this visualization, about how people think and feel with respect to this information. And so, you know, humans and the way that we communicate and learn about things and think about things, you know, is a complicated system, just like any other complicated system. But social and behavioral science can help us sort of understand and especially help us shape those broader impacts, parts of our natural science projects more carefully. And so can we create communications that's based on evidence versus just on our intuition? And with respect to climate change in particular, I think it's especially important that we avoid communications that are harmful. So for example, if we can avoid creating feelings of hopelessness among people who are exposed to this imagery, I think that's that's a positive outcome. So that will be kind of work that's happening more towards the end of the project. But that's a little bit about what I'm working on as part of this overall effort.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen and Doug. That was excellent. Much appreciated, and a great sort of connection to what Higgs travels were, and a good preview of what's to come. We got several questions in the chat, so I think we should probably recognize those first. I've accumulated a few myself, of course, and we'll see what others are out there. Jeremy, early on, I just want to go back to a question that Jeremy had early on for Hig about the species that he observed on the glacier, sprucer, mountain hemlock. And Jeremy, do you want to just clarify why you asked that particular question? Does that tell us something about what's going on in the surface there? Jeremy?
But yeah, to answer the question, I guess it actually is pretty striking, as you'll see hemlock really commonly off glacier. We did not encounter any mountain or western hemlock on ice. It was all citrus fruit. I don't think it's probably quite that simple, but I don't have a good answer though. I mean, you see a lot of alder, willow, cottonwood, and spruce, and the alder typically is taking root first, and you'll even see alder in places where the ice is really actively moving, roots are stretched, like that sort of thing. Whereas the big spruce forest, including meter diameter trees, like big trees, is out in the relatively stable areas. Okay,
great, thank you. Next up. Liz had a question for Kristen about a book that you've seen. Liz, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, Kristen actually answered in the chat, but I will just let folks know, because anyone who's doing science communication may find it interesting. There's a new book out called Getting to the Heart of Science Communication that really deals with the issues of how a lot of science communication is very overwhelming for the public. So full disclosure, I haven't read it yet. But it's on my to read pile. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of our inspiration for our trips was the what seemed to be some effective pathways to communication that we found in sort of the narrative element of kind of communicating scientific issues by going somewhere and bumbling around like an idiot there, and then trying to wrap whatever you might, whatever interesting things you learned, wrapping it in that narrative provides a very digestible format. It's definitely been a big driver for what we've done.
Kristen, I really enjoyed your slide where you sort of you classified messengers, messages, and I forget the last classification, the outcomes, something to that effect.
Yeah.
Go ahead. And I was reminded and appropriately humbled when scientists were just one of the group of messengers, and there were many other elements forward from that. But I was wondering, will you explore at all how messages are communicated? I got the impression that you were going to survey and evaluate how people are communicating about Malaspina Glacier changes to people who might not necessarily ever see a glacier, and certainly not see Malaspina Glacier. But will you also will you consider subgroups? For example, I don't know if it's possible to even have a group in Yakutat, or more broadly, say in Alaska, to understand how Alaskans or or Yakutatians. I'm not sure what their preferred nomenclature is, are viewing changes that are going on there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the work that I proposed is basically just looking at, basically I made the argument that we could survey a sort of representative sample of Americans as kind of a proxy for what realistically, like, the people who might be seeing these materials, because it's right that a lot of sort of the general public might not actually be able to go out and see the Malaspina Glacier in person. And so there's a little bit of that disconnect there. But I mean, there has been work like back in 2006, kind of surveying Alaskans' opinions about climate change and some of the impacts, but there hasn't been work since then. So that's something that I'm really interested in trying to pursue and trying to find funding for. So that's maybe a brief answer to that question. But yeah, we're just kind of looking at that one little part. And through this literature review, I think it is very interesting. In some of my previous work, I've been working with journalists and talking with them about sort of how they talk about climate in their work. And so it is very interesting. It would be interesting to ask the question of, why do journalists pick the glacier picture over something else when they go to talk about climate in some of their reporting?
Yeah, that's a great way to wrap it up too. That really gets at the heart of the emotional element. Why? Yeah, I would love to know the answer to that. Caitlin had a question for Doug. Caitlin, do you want to pose that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Doug, I was wondering about the Piedmont lobe switching that you mentioned, that the Piedmont section of Malaspina operates more like a delta. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the specifics of the physics that control that switching, or what the leading hypotheses are, and if you have any plans for the project to codify that and include it in a model.
Yeah, I wish I could. I wish I could state a credible evidence-based hypothesis for this, but as you know, surging is still a big mystery in glaciology in general. I think in this environment, it's very warm, obviously, so there's no thermodynamic control that's likely operating in this case. But I could spitball and say that the glacier is probably riding on a layer of very thick till that is highly nonlinear, perhaps perfectly plastic. And so as the glacier moves around and builds up high spots in certain places, it overwhelms that glacier's capacity to resist stresses and it fails locally. And that's probably strongly modulated by the movement of water and changes in the movement of water below the glacier. But we really don't know at this point what's driving that kind of behavior. We're hoping that some of the active seismic work that Martin Trufer is leading will at least help us understand maybe some of the variability in the type of material that's sitting under the glacier, whether it's bedrock or whether it's soft sediment, or whether that sediment is oozy or dry. These are the sorts of things that you can sometimes tease out of active seismic surveys. And so we're hoping to be able to say something based on that.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Not a softball question, but good answer.
When we went through in 2011, when we went out kind of at Fountain Stream there, right where the surge is pushing the front forward, there was actually a location there where you could see the basal moraine, like it just was this vertical outcrop ice, and then this super sheared, kind of platy moraine underneath it. That's right now, it was maybe only a couple meters thick right there on a hilltop, but it was, I have a photo of that. I don't know that tells you anything, but was pretty neat to actually see that, you know, I've never had another spot where I could actually just go up and touch that, you know, that basal moraine that is accommodating all that shear.
Absolutely. That's really helpful evidence, actually. I mean, like it's our only window into what's happening in that environment besides geophysical surveys and things like that. So those sorts of anecdotes are super appreciated.
You know, I do have a, if you want, I did put together an animation of the Sentinel-1 radar reflectance where you can see some of the surging, and I updated it to it's just a few days ago. So I could even do that while people continue to talk if you want.
Well, that kind of relates to a question that I had, which is, has there been an effort, you know, given the dramatic periglacial changes that are occurring, has there been an effort to quantify the, you know, spectrally, and however vague it would have to be, going back to the early Landsat days, what, you know, the change in regime in different places, and is that informative at all of what's going on with the glacier, with this delta-like surge? Yeah, so this is your Sentinel-1 reflectance, which is, when did that start? 2015, 16?
No, it's actually just basically a year back. So so I don't have the whole record. There is more going back, but this particular collection is just a short record. And I don't have an answer to what you're saying, so I'm hoping Doug will jump in.
I'm just wondering if that would give us a clue as to, you know, where periglacially things are most dynamic. So maybe that can inform where to focus understanding on the till, or the basal till, or a clue to what the glacier left behind. Just spitballing here. Hey, you've got a question in the chat from Santiago. Santiago, do you want to pose your question?
Okay, let me see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about one of the images you showed. I mean, I'm interested in dust blowouts that come out of glaciers. I've seen many from Malaspina. You did show one picture where there was quite a bit of loose silt around dead trees, and I'm just curious, how common is that kind of picture? And and have you seen one of those dust activity? Yeah.
We did not see blowing dust. There is a lot of, well, no, actually we did see some, now that I need to correct myself, we did see some evidence of blowing dust. Though the basic question, I think, is how often do you dry the surface out enough? You know, because that's the fine silts being right at the surface, either on top of the ice, in front of the ice. Like, I mean, we had really a lot of trouble finding campsites. That we'd find a campsite, it seemed really great. We'd set up our tent, and we have a floorless tent, if you picture that. And like halfway through our time there, we'd be like setting rocks and like stepping from rock to rock, because the whole surface underneath us would liquefy, because it's all this, you know, saturated silt. But we did sometimes see, you know, windblown dust, you know, like I think you'd almost call them like a ripple. I actually don't know a good term for them, but you get these windblown dust formations where you have wet ground and dust blowing onto it. And you get these kind of aggrading forms that are really weird. But I didn't see like big dust clouds coming off or anything like that. And I think, you know, in the right conditions, it would happen, but it just you have to dry that surface enough to be able to really entrain a lot of dust.
Yeah, it does happen, and you can perfectly have a wet morning, and by the afternoon it can be dry. You know, with the onset of katabatic winds, they just come down and dry everything in a few hours. Yeah, it's pretty spectacular. You can see the satellite pretty well, and not only Malaspina but Copper River too. It's yeah, it's impressive.
Are those more common when you have sub-freezing conditions? So the water in, I'm thinking the water in the surface is, in the superficial layer isn't mobile then. So you kind of sublimate dry some of the sediment, and then you can entrain it in the air, and you don't have wicking coming up because it's not liquid water below.
I think so. Yeah. I'm just a guy here in Washington, D.C. I've never been there, so but I've been looking at this for a while, and my friends who have been over there, yes, they have the same impression. And it's not it happens in late fall, but you can have it during the winter too. I mean, I recorded I have a Landsat image from early in January this year, so it can happen. My concern is that it's a type of phenomenon we are going to start to see more often. So so that's, I just curious to see what your images and how it is like to be there. Yeah?
We've got a related question from Javier. Javier, do you want to pose it?
Yeah. So hey, this area also, and a little bit over towards all the way towards the Seward Peninsula, is an area of active storms actually. And I wonder if in your, although you are focused on the glacier, there are several areas, several dynamic mechanisms that set on and maybe accelerate those processes that are combining the ocean with the glacier. So I just wonder if you're in your project. I mean, I haven't talked to Martin actually, but it might be interesting to look at that component as well, because there you can have couplings, like for example the Pacific decadal oscillation, that may accentuate, or which is an stochastic process. And so I don't know, just saying, that might be an interesting change.
Definitely super interesting, and probably a critical process for understanding potential degradation of that moraine. The only thing that we're characterizing the structure of the moraine through these geophysical mechanisms, which should at least help us understand their response to storm erosion. But in collaboration with the Park Service, we're also going to put some moorings in some of these lagoons to try and understand oceanic intrusion into that environment, to see how much water is coming over these sills and what the heat content is and so forth, in an attempt to try and understand the potential for that storm energy to start making changes in the moraine. I am certain that it will be totally inadequate relative to the complexity of that question, but at least it's a start.
Are you going to do Malaspina Lake as well as the smaller ones?
No, I think just the smaller ones at this point.
There was rack lines from probably a 50-centimeter storm surge within Malaspina Lake after that big storm that I showed photos from, which corresponds to, it's a lot of water, a lot of salt water. And the tide does reverse there every day. You can hop in there and run a pack raft up into the lagoon on a regular tide. So there's a big flux of warm salt water going into that water body.
Which is going to be super important if those lakes get bigger too. I mean, if the sort of wetted area of the terminus starts to get large, this thing's going to turn into a normal tidewater glacier, like a Columbia or something like that. And I really think we could see very quick accelerations or large accelerations and change.
I think there's potential for Fountain Stream to become a marine link also. I don't think that's happened yet, but it's really close. And I bet you during storm surges, it might happen already. Of course, now it's really complicated with the surge going on there. But yeah, those are, there's definitely marine links going on.
We're at the top of the hour. Thank you everyone for all the questions. I I mean, I kind of already thought this, but now I definitely think this. Malaspina Glacier is probably the most complicated glacier and paraglacial environment that I'm aware of. In terms of process and place and the intimate connection and figuring out what's going to be most important, it's just, kudos to you guys for trying to sort out this system and communicate what's going on there to the broader public. That is quite a feat. Yeah, any other closing remarks from anyone? Caitlin just posted a relevant popular article about Thwaites, the so-called Doomsday Glacier. I highly recommend giving Malaspina another nickname. Doomsday Glacier really caught on. Yeah, any other closing remarks from the other team leads? All right, great. Well, thank you to Tracy, to Hig, to Kristen, and Doug for presenting. That was very informative, and a great little meeting to sort of connect these different systems. Yeah, much appreciated, and nice to see some different faces with the different teams too. So with that, I will bid you adieu and great presentations, and yeah, have a great summer.